What I want to talk about today is about the concepts of neutrality, decentralization, and privacy, and what makes Bitcoin so special. Now, you'll hear me talk a lot about Bitcoin. But when I use the word Bitcoin, I'm not talking about the currency. I'm talking about a broader concept, which is the concept of completely decentralized, network-based, flat networks for providing trusted applications. And if you happen to have a completely decentralized flat network that can provide trust applications, the most logical first application is currency. But currency is just the first app. We are restructuring society by rebuilding institutions. And traditionally, institutions in this world have been hierarchical. This was an invention of industrialization, an 18th century concept to allow people to organize and communicate at larger scale. And it was very effective at breaking the monopolies of kings and feudal systems. And it's now run its course. Sometimes people ask me what my political positions are, and it's very difficult to explain, but one word captures it, I think. I'm a disruptarian. And what that means is that every 30 or 40 years, at least, things that have settled need to be disrupted. Because as they settle, power accumulates, they become centralized. And with centralized power, corruption happens. Now, this isn't a new concept. My ancestors, I come from Greece, figured out that corruption happens in systems of power. And absolute power produces absolute corruption, and there is no more absolute power than the power of money. We live in a world where banking was a great liberator after the 15th century, an invention that moved finance from the realm of kings to the realm of everyday people. And that system liberated billions of people, and then it got concentrated, and it acquired power, and the power led to corruption. And what we're left with today is not a liberating system, and it's time to disrupt it. And Bitcoin is one of the things that will greatly disrupt centralization of power. Why is that? One of the things that interests me as a computer scientist working in distributed systems is the architecture of systems. Architecture is a great topic for this city. And the architecture of systems is what ultimately produces the outcomes. I've worked with a lot of bankers. They're nice people. They try to feed their family, pay their mortgage, keep a steady job. Among them, there are a few sociopaths who inevitably rise to the highest positions of power because sociopathy is an advantage in hierarchical systems. But most of the problems with traditional concentration of power and money has nothing to do with the people being evil. It has to do with the fact that these institutions, through their shape, through their architecture, produce outcomes that are not good. They produce outcomes that are not egalitarian. They produce outcomes that are restrictive. They start to express nativism, nationalism, tribalism, class structure. And all of these things make the world a smaller place. In fact, over the last 15 years, we've seen the internet become an enormous power for the decentralization of communications, and it has been a very liberating force. But if you look at economic inclusion and how banking works, we haven't expanded opportunity, we haven't expanded access. In fact, we're now regressing. Economic inclusion is reducing. And the reason it's reducing is because these isolated structures of finance, their very architecture raises walls. National borders, class structures, and differences in how your money and your commerce is treated. We live in a world that is increasingly global and interconnected. There's even an emergent global culture through the internet, and yet our financial systems are parochial, insular, and they're separated. If you look at it from a network perspective, there are systems of money for transmitting small amounts, and systems of money for transmitting large amounts. Systems of money for consumer payments, systems of money for business-to-business payments, and all of these are separated geographically based on borders, legal jurisdictions, nation-states. And so what this structure produces is separation. It means that as people, we are less and less free to transact with the rest of the world. Geopolitics is affecting finance in a great way because the combination of state and money produces toxic results. And we're about to disrupt all that. What Bitcoin's architecture gives us is a new way of organizing the world. Exactly the same way that the internet flattened access to communication, made every system that connects to it an equal peer. If I have an IP address, my packets are treated no differently than the packets of anybody else on the network. For the most part, that gives voice to everyone. It gives everyone the power of the printing press on a global scale. And Bitcoin will do the same by giving everyone the power of banking on a global scale. Think of it like desktop banking, the way desktop printing, desktop publishing, and websites changed communications, desktop banking, individually controlled banking, with all of the power of the largest bank in the world. That's what creates disruption. Imagine a world where every person has the ability to not only execute transactions, but create complex financial systems and instruments without asking for anybody's permission. Simply by connecting to the network, they can start a new application. Centralized systems can't do that. In a centralized system, the further out you are, the less control you have. And the further in you go into the system and up the hierarchy, the more controlled, the more limited the access is. But not with Bitcoin. With systems like Bitcoin, every node on the network has equal access to all of the financial services. In a centralized system, if you want to build a new application, two things have to happen. First, you have to ask for permission. And then permission is only granted if that application can apply to very large populations and be profitable. On the internet or on Bitcoin, all that is needed to start an application is two nodes, two people, two systems. They can start communicating, construct their own protocols, their own systems, and that application with only two people using it is just as valid as every other application on the network. When you look at the internet, the fundamental misunderstanding is that people think that the power of the internet comes from the ability to transmit information fast. But the real power of the internet comes from net neutrality. And net neutrality is the concept that the internet does not discriminate based on source, destination, or content. Bitcoin is the first financial network that exhibits neutrality. When you do a Bitcoin transaction, the network doesn't care about the source, the destination, the amount, or what type of financial application it's supporting. Simply, did you pay a sufficient fee to use the network resources? And if you did, your application is valuable. We have an interesting conversation happening in Bitcoin right now. Perhaps some of you have heard the term spam transactions. Have you heard that? What is a spam transaction? What does it mean for a transaction to be spam? I think that term is meaningless. Because to decide which transactions are spam and which are not, you're making a top-down judgment. You're imposing in the architecture the choices of which applications are legitimate. To who? Legitimate to the end user? There's no such thing as a spam transaction, simply because if a transaction carries enough fee, that means that the sender of that transaction felt it was valuable enough to transmit, and therefore it is a legitimate transaction. This replaces the concept of controlling content by making decisions about what is good, what is bad, what is legitimate, what is illegitimate, what is a valuable application, what is not a valuable application, with a simple market mechanism. If your transactions are valuable and you paid essentially a tiny fee because of the democratization of finance, then your transaction is valuable and is not spam. Starting in the 1970s, we have seen the world begin to adopt digital currencies. When people call Bitcoin a digital currency, they're missing the point. The euro is a digital currency. The US dollar is a digital currency. Less than 8% of these currencies exists in physical form. The rest is bits on ledgers. But the fundamental difference is that these ledgers are controlled by centralized organizations, whereas in Bitcoin, they're not. You have a decentralized network, an open network. So Bitcoin isn't a digital currency. It's a cryptocurrency. It's a network-centric money. I really like the idea of a network-centric money. In fact, in my opinion, the word Bitcoin is a terrible name. It just sucks. I mean, if you're a designer, think about it for a second. Bits, which either means small, or it means the person who just said that is a geek, none of which is appealing to general population. And coin, a physical token of money used to describe the least physical form of money we've ever designed. If I could rename it, I'd rename it trustnet, because that's what Bitcoin is. It's a network that allows you to replace trust in institutions, trust in hierarchies, with trust on the network acting as a massively diffuse arbiter of truth, resolving any disagreements about transactions and security in a way where no one has control. So starting in the 1970s, our currencies began to be digital. But this is not the same digital as Bitcoin. This started a dream for governments, the dream of being able one day to control every financial transaction of every human being on the planet in a way that everything was visible to the power structures, where privacy dies, where the ability to make a transaction immediately puts you under the lens of systems that surveil you. We have been creating a system of global financial surveillance, a system of totalitarian financial surveillance throughout the world, and that system, which requires identification and credit checking and limited access, is responsible for the fact that economic inclusion is regressing. It is responsible for the fact that 2.5 billion people have absolutely no access to banking. And that's just the heads of household, not counting their families. And that's not counting people who have limited access to banking in a single currency within a single border. If you count all of them, really you're starting to go into the high billions. It's difficult to really estimate what economic exclusion means, but I'll give you a simple calculation. As a member of the privileged elite of the developed world, I have the ability to open a brokerage account in 24 hours electronically. And within 24 hours, I can be trading in yen on the Tokyo stock market. I can be sending and receiving money anywhere in the world without really any limits. All I have to do is sacrifice my privacy and my freedom. Because while I can do all of those things and they're very powerful, there are some things I can't do. I'm not talking about buying drugs. That's not really that interesting. What I'm talking about is simple things like, for example, donating to an activist organization like WikiLeaks. A few years ago, WikiLeaks was completely cut off from the world financial systems simply with extrajudicial pressure applied on 5 major payment providers: Visa, MasterCard, the banking transfer system, PayPal, etc. Right? And without any legal process, without any conviction, and perhaps, in my opinion, without absolutely any crime other than revealing the truth of crime, WikiLeaks was cut off the world financial system. This is now happening not just to activist organizations, it's happening to entire countries. And just like that, the dream of nation states to create the totalitarian financial systems that started in the 70s died on January 3rd, 2009, with the invention of Bitcoin and the mining of the Genesis block. Bitcoin is censorship resistant. You may have heard this term. You cannot control where money is transmitted in Bitcoin. It's not attached to identities or geography. In Bitcoin, surveillance of everyone is not possible, and in fact is going to get much harder because privacy is increasing on Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, censorship resistance is an artifact that's created by neutrality. The architecture of a flat network without borders, the architecture of neutrality that doesn't ascribe any meaning to source destination value, is what creates censorship resistance. Privacy is very important, but it's a term that often has very deep political meaning. And I like to juxtapose it to another term, that of secrecy. What is the difference between privacy and secrecy? Ultimately, and practically in today's vocabulary, privacy is the right of billions of individuals to not be surveilled, and secrecy is the power of the very few to escape accountability, to have no transparency. We live in a world where every individual transaction you do through the financial system is cataloged, analyzed, transmitted to intelligence services all around the world that collaborate. And yet, We have no idea what our governments do with money. The financial systems of the powerful are completely opaque. Our transactions are completely visible through this system of surveillance. This world is upside down, and Bitcoin writes it. Because privacy is a human right, and secrecy is a privilege of power. And we need to be in a world where we have complete, ultimate, strong privacy for the billions of people, because that is a human right, because that is a cornerstone of the freedoms of expression, association, political speech, and all of the other freedoms are very much attached to privacy. And we need to live in a world where secrecy is fickle and easily pierced, where power has to face accountability because they are under the spotlight of transparency. We need to flip the system upside down. One of my favorite words is a French word, surveillance. It is the opposite of surveillance. Surveillance means to look from above. Surveillance means to look from below. And in their dream of nation-states of controlling all of our financial futures, they made one major miscalculation. It's a hell of a lot harder for a few 100,000 people to watch 7.5 billion. But what do you think happens when 7.5 billion of us stare back? When the panopticon turns around, when our financial systems, our communication systems are private, and secrecy is an illusion that can't be sustained. When crimes committed in the names of states and powerful corporations are vulnerable to hackers and whistleblowers and leakers, when everything eventually comes out, we have a great advantage, because the natural balance of the system is one in which individuals can have privacy, but the powerful cannot have secrecy anymore. And Bitcoin is one of the first steps in that. The ability to transact across borders means that we will now be able to extend financial services to billions of people who have no access. Not through complicated technology necessarily. I speak sometimes to various regional banks, the ones that are not afraid of Bitcoin. They tell me things like 80% of our population is 100 miles from the nearest bank branch, and we can't serve them. In one case, they said 100 miles by canoe. I'll let you guess which country that was. And yet, even in the remotest places on Earth, now there's a cell phone tower. And even in the poorest places on Earth now, we see a little solar panel on a little hut that feeds a Nokia 1000 phone, the most produced device in the history of manufacturing. Billions of them have shipped. And we can turn every one of those into not a bank account, but a bank. 2 weeks ago, President Obama at South by Southwest did a presentation, and he talked about our privacy. And he said, if we can't unlock the phones, that means that everyone has a Swiss bank account in their pocket. That's not entirely accurate. I don't have a Swiss bank account in my pocket. I have a Swiss bank with the ability to generate 2 billion addresses off a single seed and use a different address for every transaction. And that bank is completely encrypted, so even if you do unlock the phone, I still have access to my bank. That represents the cognitive dissonance between the powers of centralized secrecy and the power of privacy as a human right that we now have within our grasp. And if you think this is going to be easy, or that it's going to be without struggle, you're very mistaken. If you read anything about Bitcoin, you will see the very same things that they said about the internet in the early 90s. It is a haven of pedophiles, terrorists, drug dealers, and criminals. How many of you in this room have Bitcoin? How many of you in this room are terrorists, pedophiles, drug dealers, or criminals? You see, the thing about Bitcoin is while they push this story, every now and then, someone who's never heard of Bitcoin notices two important things. One, it's still not dead. Which is always surprising because every 2 or 3 months there's an article that says it's dead. And that's great marketing, right? Because every time someone hears it's dead and 3 months later they hear it's still not dead, they think, this thing really tends to survive. I call Bitcoin the internet of money, but perhaps we should call it the zombie of currencies. It is the currency that is the undead. And so the issue here is that we're now creating a system that is threatening the largest industry in the world, and that is finance. And they are going to object, they are going to push back, and they are going to use the most common and effective emotional tactic there is, which is fear. They will treat you in such a way as if you are idiots and try to persuade you that this is something to fear. And when people hear that message, maybe the next day they come to one of these meetups and they meet a dentist who owns Bitcoin, an architect who owns Bitcoin, a taxi driver who uses Bitcoin to send money back to their family, normal people who use Bitcoin to give themselves financial power and financial freedom. And every time that message is broken by cognitive dissonance, Bitcoin wins. So all Bitcoin really has to do is survive. And so far, it's doing pretty well. And even if Bitcoin was attacked, there are 750 alternative currencies built on the same design, many of which are far stealthier, far more robust, at least at the scale they are now. And who knows? Bitcoin will get more robust, or something else will replace it. In fact, it's ironic because in the new network-centric world, currencies occupy evolutionary niches. They evolve like species based on the stimulus they have from their environment. Bitcoin is a dynamic system with software developers that can change it. So the question is, in which direction will Bitcoin evolve? Which environmental niche will it attempt to fit in? And how will that be affected by the actions of the powerful? Because here's one of the problems they have. If they attack Bitcoin, it evolves to defend itself against predators, just like any species. If they attack Bitcoin's anonymity, it evolves to become more anonymous. If they attack its resilience, it evolves to become more decentralized. In the end, despite all of the messages of fear, Bitcoin is the cuddly little bear of currencies, and you do not want to kick it. Because as in evolution, if you stomp on the little gecko, it will evolve until it's a Komodo dragon, and then you can't stomp on it. Sometimes people ask me, do you think governments will ban Bitcoin? Do you think they'll try to regulate it out of existence? Do you think they will attack it with denial of service attacks? And the answer is really simple, because in network-centric systems, systems that are dynamic and adaptable, systems that exhibit anti-fragility, attacks cause the system to adapt and evolve and become resistant. Think about this for just a second. I've been involved in the internet since 1989, and I remember very clearly in the early days when lots of articles were written about how the internet was not resilient, could not scale to do voice, was not secure. And I remember times when denial of service attacks would take down Yahoo, Alta Vista, and even Google for hours, sometimes days. So what happened between then and now? How many times have you seen Google go down in the last 5 years? And so the question is, have people stopped attacking Google? Oh, quite the opposite. Google can now sustain gigabits of denial of service anywhere in the world and dynamically reroute. And the same applies for all internet applications. The attacks didn't stop. The system became immune. Because like a human immune system, if you are exposed to a virus and it doesn't kill you, you evolve resistance. And the next time you're exposed to the virus, it does nothing to you. So will governments try to ban Bitcoin, regulate Bitcoin, attack Bitcoin? They already are. They have been, almost since the beginning. And Bitcoin keeps getting stronger. It's a system that is under constant denial of service attack, that is on the internet, being attacked by hackers, by agents, by other systems, 24 hours a day. In security, we have a really funny term, which is a honeypot, right? A honeypot is a system that is designed to attract hackers. Well, what bigger honeypot could you have than a financial network that has $6 billion on it? If you hack Bitcoin, there is a $6 billion reward for you finding a way to hack it. No one has collected that reward yet, and it's not because they haven't been trying. They've been trying non-stop. But systems like Bitcoin are resilient. So remember that what we're doing here is not a currency. It is a reworking of the societal systems of organization that have failed us. The 18th century system of hierarchies that does not scale to a global interconnected world is being replaced by network-centric flat architectures, whether that's the internet or any of the applications running on top of it, or Bitcoin itself. And currency is just the first app. When you have a network that can provide you with neutral trust, you can build myriads of applications on top, and you don't even have to ask for permission. Bitcoin is much more than currency. And when I say that Bitcoin is the internet of money, the emphasis is not on money. The emphasis is on internet. So welcome to the future of money. Thank you.